Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and today we are going to discuss what I would define as one of the lesser known, though something tells me that I'm going to get a serious earache for this, but one of the lesser known founding fathers. And just so you all know, apparently John Hancock isn't Will Smith, the film, so I just thought you should all know this. MC, would you like to tell us about this gentleman?
Okay, John Hancock. All right, John Hancock is most well known for his signature. We'll get to that a little bit later. All right, but it's not Will Smith, and as far as I know, he's not related to Will Smith or any of the characters that Will Smith has ever portrayed. All right, all right. John Hancock was obviously born in the Massachusetts colony. He, as a very young, young lad, his father, who was a preacher, died, right, leaving his mother and his siblings with him. His mother moved into her family household, took her back in, but of course, when as things like that happened in those time frames, obviously there was you needed that couldn't be sustained, and so his his uncle on his father's side took him in. Okay. Now, his uncle was an extraordinarily wealthy man for the time in America. He was one of not the most richest man in Massachusetts.
Okay.
He was also childless. Okay. So John Hancock became his surrogate son, and later on is adopted by him and his wife. All right, and his newly adopted father is a well-known merchant, has a lot of mercantile interests. All right, throughout the colonies, and he begins the process, all right, of grooming, his what's going to become his young heir, right? Yeah. To include, right, sending him to Harvard College, right, where he graduates, all right, graduates from Harvard, and then is helping with the family business. He in I think it's 1760 travels to Great Britain, right? Travels to London and spends a year and a half in London. All right, making connections, doing things for the family business. He returns, of course, and his father, his adopted father, is now sickly, and slowly begins to turn over everything to him. And eventually, when he passes away, John Hancock inherits his entire estate. All right, so John Hancock is a very wealthy individual. Now, he's also a younger man, and this kind of puts him a little bit at odds, because one of the things that he was known for, one of the things that he did do, right, is he was known as a bit of a dandy, in that he liked extravagant clothes. Yeah. All right, he did dress with as an aristocrat, for lack of a better term. Okay. He was not part of the aristocrat set, all right, which as we understand it, all right. But he did dress the part. Now, did that mean he was, living the extravagant, hedonistic lifestyle of the nobles? No, all right. He did like finer things as far as clothing, and of course his I think some of the furnishings in his house. But he was not a party goer. Okay, he was not someone living the high life. All right, dancing the night away. And drinking and tawdry kind of things. All right.
I'm really waiting for you to say strutting his funky stuff. I can seriously see you saying those words.
so he was not like that. All right. Okay. Now, because of his wealth, all right, he of course this leads him into the political realm. All right, as the Stamp Act and everything come to the fore. And during the phase of the Stamp Act, he takes a position of Parliament being wrong to issue it, but at the same time that you should go ahead and pay it, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are, however, certain things that people have to talk about, right? Now, the first incident happens is in 1768. One of his ships, all right, is called the Lydia, is involved in an affair, all right, and the British basically attempt to board the ship, all right, looking for smuggled goods. Okay, John Hancock finds that they're trying to board the ship to look for smuggled goods without any writ. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And at which point he says, look, if you don't have a writ, you're not coming on board the ship. All right. And he gets people to help throw them off, all right, to prevent that. That same year, another one of his ships, all right, the U.S., the Liberty, I shouldn't say the U.S. because there is no U.S., but the Liberty, all right, that gets boarded, right, and they find 25 bottles of French wine. Okay. For lack of a better term, I said bottles, but whatever you keep wine in, right? I'm not a big wine drinker. I know that they're kept in bottles, but I don't know if that's the proper term for how wine was shipped. Right?
I have no idea, unfortunately. Not being with
but
it.
It can't just be 25 bottles, though. It's got to be some kind of larger thing. So only because they said that this is about approximately 1/4 of the ship's capacity. All right, shipping capacity. Okay.
Yeah.
And what the British suspect is they suspect that that previous night that 3/4 of the cargo had been unloaded. All right, without paying the tax on it, because John, Hancock paid the tax, the duty tax on the rest of the wine, right, as appropriate, whatever 25 pence or whatever it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. He went ahead and paid that. That was not a problem or anything, right? And you got to remember the guy is wealthy. The guy is extraordinarily wealthy at this point. The British, however, are not satisfied, and later on, well, they don't have any proof that anything happened, right? But later on, one of the people that was on board the ship when they initially looked at it, recanted his tale and said, no, they shipped off prior to the boarding. There was over 100 casks or whatever of wine. All right, yeah. that got unloaded, right? Now, so the British seize the ship, and then they attempt to row the ship out to the customs people, trying to row the ship out to the British authorities with one of the British warships, the Romney, is in port, right? Now, there's several things that are going on when this happens, right? First of all, the skipper of the Romney, when it came into the Boston port, had a problem. And the problem was that his sailors didn't like him. And what happens when sailors don't like you is they tend to jump ship.
Yeah. So
he had sent impressment gangs, right, through Boston, right, to reacquire the sailors. And of course, as you well know, the impressment gangs were not really picky about whether or not you were really supposed to be on board the ship or not. You were a body in the wrong place at the wrong time when they came through and hit you over the head with a blackjack and carried you on board.
Yeah.
And said, congratulations, you're the next mate. Right? Sure. So the citizens of Boston were hardly amused with this captain. Okay, and or they jumping. They didn't tend to. The purpose was not to kill you, though. They are trying to take you on board. Okay.
Congratulations, you're a sailor. Bet you weren't expecting that.
Well, yeah. I mean, and of course, John Hancock argues that he was charged with smuggling, right? And during the trial, which takes place later on, they seized the ship. All right. At which point the citizens basically get rowdy, and the customs officials flee for their lives. Right, and they're trying to run to the Romney. They run to the Romney because they said that they're going to be lynched if they don't do it. Mm-hmm. To be honest, it's their fear has some merit to it. Okay, there were several customs officials in Boston that had been beaten by this time. All right, they were not well liked.
No.
Okay, the crowds got kind of ugly. All right, they burned in front of John Hancock's house. They burned several of their boats in effigy, like effigy boats. All right, of the customs officials and so forth. So to say that they were not they were going to be perfectly fine and they were overreacting, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that they were overreacting. All right. Now the officials in Boston said they were overreacting, that they were perfectly safe, and that's the only reason that they ran to the Romney is that they wanted British forces to basically take over Boston. Right. Yeah. Which is probably true as well. All right. But that doesn't mitigate the fact that they probably, if they would have stood their ground, probably would have had some nefarious things happen to them. So during the trial, which is a naval court trial, all right. It is not a jury trial. It's done in the naval courts, with John Hancock. Obviously he is an attorney, kind of, all right, because he's been trained in Harvard, right? But he's also defended by John Adams, all right. And the trial goes on for about 5 months or so, and then the British court drops all charges against him. However, they never return the liberty. Okay. In fact, they keep the liberty, and they use the liberty to try to capture smugglers. And this goes on for about a year before the liberty runs aground in Rhode Island. At which point, during a storm, and what happens is the people of Rhode Island row out and burn the ship to the ground. Okay, so he never gets the liberty back. All right. Yeah. And so even though the court dropped the charges, they keep the ship. Now, another aspect, and this is something else that people tend to not understand about the time frame, is John Hancock while he himself had a reason to possibly smuggle, right? And smuggling was, I don't know if you'd call it rampant, but not uncommon. Yeah. Okay. That's just the way it was, right? It wasn't uncommon that people would try to skip out on the duties, mainly because there was, quite frankly, a lot of them were complicated, because you had different duties for different areas where you got goods, right? Yeah. You would have different duties if you were getting goods from the mainland or from France versus what you were getting from England, what you were getting from Barbados, what you were getting from the Caribbean, or wherever else the things were coming from. You'd have all these different possible connections. Yeah. Right. So don't be a hater, Ghostogy. All right. Then again, Pirate Women got off scot-free 90% of the time, and 2 were way more successful. Well, I wouldn't say that the 2 were way more successful, and history doesn't actually say what happened to them. So we can talk about the female pirates one day later on. This, of course, leads him to where he was taking a more moderate position before. All right, leads him into being patriot for the patriot cause.
Yeah.
Okay, he is elected. All right, to the Massachusetts, Senate, for lack of a better term, the Massachusetts legislature. The Massachusetts legislature declares itself sovereign. Right.
Just one thing before you go any further. Do you mind changing the word patriot to rebel? I think I'm feeling slightly offended. Okay.
No, it's gonna be patriot.
Yeah. Bloody colonials.
It's gonna be a patriot. And you know about that thing called Lexington and Concord, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Lexington and Concord, the British were quite unamused by the by the colonials, as you call us, all right, declaring themselves independent as far as the or autonomous, right? With Boston and the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared themselves autonomous.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they were looking for the quote-unquote rebel rousers, right? The rabble, of whom they named 2 individuals, one of whom was John Adams, and you can guess that the other one was John Hancock. Right? The whole Lexington and Concord affair takes place because the British initially move out in an attempt to capture John Hancock and John Adams.
Didn't know that. Cool.
The whole Paul Revere ride was them letting the people know that they're coming to try and get these guys and arrest them. Now they escaped Lexington. They were at Lexington at the time when it first began, and traveled to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress. All right. Now it's at the Continental Congress where he is. Got to remember, John Hancock and John Adams were both elected or selected or voted to be representatives to the Continental Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And while they were there, all right, John Hancock is somewhat of an ambitious individual, all right,
Mm-hmm.
and he, behind the scenes, all right, tries to make a play to become the general, to become the leading general of the Continental Army, right? Yeah. Because obviously this is going to be an important position. It's going to be a world-known position, well-known, etc. But the problem is, of course, is while John Hancock is certainly young and ambitious, all right, and bright, okay, he has no military experience, right? Just simple, straight up, just a little malicious stuff here and there, but nothing of any note, right? And of course, there's Washington, okay, not saying he wants the job, but he shows up at the Continental Congress every day in uniform, right? Making it quite plain to everybody, all right, that, he has the experience. And of all the people that are around there, he is one of the most experienced and one of the most well-known military men in the Americas at the time, all right? And it's John Adams via work with basically Benjamin Franklin that selects, okay, and gets pushed through George Washington as the general of the Continental Army, and they also then, all right, select John Hancock. And many people call this a ceremonial position, and it is to a degree, right, as president of the Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, So he has a kind of an overall ceremonial role. All right. Now, of course, this leads to, as the war continues, as the battles continue, John Hancock is there for the declaration of, obviously, the passing of the Declaration of Independence. Okay. Now he's well known in Massachusetts. He's a well known patriot. They're very happy with the man overall. All right. And when everybody says, okay, this is the document and this is what we're going to approve. Okay. The myth goes, right. And it's impossible to know the truth of this, but there's got to be some weight to it. All right. Simply from human nature. After it was passed, people were like, okay, now what? Okay, we've passed this. Well, how, who's going to sign it? And so they were kind of looking at one another because they know as soon as their signatures on that, okay,
Mm-hmm.
they are, they're not going to be, they're going to be enemies to the state. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
Right? Well, the myth goes that John Hancock grabs it and puts his signature on it, and he said, "I'm signing it so large that even, King George without his spectacles will have no doubt on who it is." Right? And he of course signs the document. And here's an example of the signature. Now, we don't know if he actually said that, all right? It just comes down as a myth. But there is one thing that is quite obvious, all right? One, John Hancock's signature is pretty bold.
It is noticeable, I have to say.
Right? And it stands out for being nowhere near anyone else's and right in the middle of this. Okay, and it's and let's be honest, here's another picture of the signature, general, another thing of the signature. This is a beautiful signature. The man had awesome penmanship.
Oh, yeah.
All right, this is close to artwork. It really is. I don't care who you are. Right? There's no way I could write a sign a signature or anything like that. This is beautifully done.
Oh, yes.
Right. I mean, there are things about the man that you got to appreciate, right? So as the war progresses, of course, there's a push when Howe moves to New York, right? And while he's in New York, one of the things that they want to do is they want to seize Rhode Island's port at Newport. Newport, Rhode Island. Now, at the time, Newport was the fourth largest city in America. Right?
Wow.
At 9,500 people. Right?
God, that's embarrassing. But yeah, okay.
Well, you got to remember. I mean, this is the early colonial period. 9,000 people. 9,000 people is more people than you realize, right? For people who don't understand, 9,000 people. I came from a small town called Wisner, Nebraska. Wisner, Nebraska is a small little town. It 2,000 people, right? A population of around 2,000. All right, and this is 5 times that size. So you can appreciate, all right, when you start seeing how big these are, how big this is for that time frame. That this is a bustling port and a bustling city, all right. And the under Howe, they send 7,100 troops, all right, to take Newport, which they basically take Newport without firing a shot. There is no battle for Newport at this point. And they send 7,100 people. 3,100 of them are Hessians.
Yeah.
Right? Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because you have to understand the time frame. You took a town of 9,000, right, and you just added to that town 7,100. In other words, you almost doubled the size of that town with a single invasion force. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, what does that cause? Well, first of all, this becomes problematic for the people because where are these guys going to live? Where you know, they got to stay somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So where are you going to put them, right? This comes down to being impressed, and you have to give up your house. You've got to let these people live in your house and all this other stuff. This is why these issues were important to Americans when we signed later on the Constitution, right?
Yeah.
Right, because they basically went in there and they just basically said you're gonna have so many people living in your house, and not only do they say you're gonna have so many people living in your house, you have to provide food for these idiots.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just that I'm trying to get people to understand why there was so much resentment for this. Right now, the rest of the colony, and if you ever take a look at how big Rhode Island is very, very small.
Yes.
Landmass wise, it's like a postage stamp. It almost looks like a postage stamp as well, right?
Isn't it actually supposed to be one of the smallest of the states?
It is the smallest state.
Oh, there we go. Okay,
It is literally the smallest state, right? And it happens to be where my mother was born, but that's a side issue. A slight side issue, slight side issue, right? So Washington, all right, in 1778, the French had declared war on Britain. They declared themselves an alliance with the Americans. The French fleet, right, comes, and they impress upon Washington that we need to do a coordinated attack against the British forces at Newport. This gives us an opportunity, right? So Washington orders General Sullivan, all right, to raise troops in the Massachusetts area and so forth, and basically attack Newport. Now, at this point, they've drawn some of the troops down. It's most of the troops are still most of the Hessians are there, but a good portion of the British troops have left. There's only about 5,800 British troops, right, occupying Newport now at this point in one of the islands, right? Mm-hmm. The French arrive, all right, and initially they see the British fleet, but the British fleet that's there, all right, most of it sails off. The British ended up screwing over the Hessians. Never paid them in a bed. They did. That's very true.
I would like it noted, no one cares, the German.
All right. They become an interesting problem after the war, right? Because many of them don't go back.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But anyway, and during this time, all right, as Sullivan is gathering troops and everything, they activate the Massachusetts militia, which is being led at this point by John Hancock. All right. And his aide-de-camp is Lieutenant Colonel Paul Revere, right? So they march down and they begin to invest, all right, Newport. Okay. Now, when the British left, okay, the French fleet commander, the Estes, he had a choice. He could help the Americans, all right, assail the fort, right, or he could sail off after the British and have a sea battle with the British. Okay. So he looks at the American forces. Now, you got to remember, the American forces are a ragtag kind of a group. All right. Their forces are slowly building. This is not a a military command under a single chain of command. This is, John Sultan has about 2,000 regular Continentals and probably another 2,000 direct subordinates that are worth a damn, all right, under him. So he has approximately 4,000 troops.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then the rest of it is a smattering of these other colonials and everything. It's not enough, all right, to charge the works, all right, to take Newport News. It's not. It's just not. They just do not have the forces to do it. The British, of course, seeing that a battle's coming, remove themselves from the forward island, which it was protecting basically the harbor, right, and move straight into the city itself behind fortified positions. So the Americans then basically take the island and begin, setting up landing and everything for them, and both sides begin to shoot cannons at one another, right? And of course, every day, while this is going on for a few days, everyone looks to the sea to see in the morning whose ships are showing up, right? Because they know that the French have sailed and so forth. And during this time, also, of course, the American forces are growing. They grow to approximately, they swell to approximately 10,000 total, right, for a while. Right?
Nice.
And then as they wait, and there's a siege going on, and it is something of a siege going on. The American forces, after a time, waiting for the French, waiting a few days for the French, and the French not showing, decide, okay, I'm not going to charge, a fortified position, right? So they just start to melt away, right? And then finally, okay, they see ships coming from the horizon. And the ships come over, and it's the French ships. It's the French ships, but the French ships are badly damaged. Okay? And I mean badly damaged. Now, why? You would think that, oh crap, the British are coming. They beat the hell out of the French forces. No, that's not what happened. In fact, what the British plan is to have the French commander chase them toward the south, towards New York, and when they get there, they were going to outnumber the French forces on the Navy. They were going to have a great naval battle, and they were going to destroy them. So while the French forces did all that, while both sides were preparing for battle, a big storm arose and hammered both fleets. So a lot of the Estes' ships weren't damaged by the British. They were damaged from the storm, and so he doesn't want to attack, support an attack on the fort. Plus the fact that he's looking at there's only 5,000 Americans again. So he says, look, we're going to Boston, right? So the Americans begin a retreat. Right? During the retreat, okay, the British, of course, see this as an opportunity. We can bag the entire lot, right?
Yeah. And
the only reason I'm even bringing this up, and this is just a small skirmish, is the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, all right, takes the assignment to guard the retreat, to be the rear guard, all right? The Hessians send an attack, it's repulsed by these guards. All right, they send a second attack, it's repulsed again. And they are repulsing these Hessians in hand-to-hand combat, okay, to allow the rest of the American command to retreat, which it does, for all intents and purposes, in good order. The Hessians get reinforcements, and they finally, on the third attack, basically break it and rout the Rhode Island 1st Regiment. Now, the Rhode Island 1st Regiment was very unusual in that it was made up of Native Americans. A third of them were African American slaves, and then the rest were white. So you had about a third white, a third Indian, and a third slaves. right?
Yeah.
Who had been promised their freedom if they fought for the colonies, right? Which they did, and they fought. This action is quite noticeable because they stood toe to toe with the Hessians in hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah.
Okay?
That is actually quite impressive, to be fair.
And being outnumbered, especially to be able to hold those positions. Now, granted, you're on the defense. You have the breastworks and so forth that you're fighting from behind, but still, right? You're fighting hand to hand, right? You may have the advantage of terrain and so forth, but you're not. You're definitely outnumbered and so forth. So, this is an example of what was different. The American forces. All right. I mean, the French commander, basically, or I should say, one of the aides of Lafayette, right, says that this is just a ragpage of. It's like they grabbed every tailor and sailmaker and cobbler, and he got on some nag and went on down here to fight. Which, okay, it is a citizen army. That's true. It isn't the standing professional armies that we think of as today. These guys had normal lives and then picked up a rifle, all right, to go to battle and pick up a rifle with a nice sharp knife at the end. Okay. It's a different mentality. It's a different world that you're dealing with. And yet and this is something true of the Americans as a whole. The Americans as a whole tended to fight very valiantly, all right, unless they were flanked. Okay. And I'm talking about the militia kind of thing. So they acquitted themselves halfway decently, but at the end of the day, right, the field was left to the British.
Yeah.
Right. Now, a year later, right, in 1779, they're forced to withdraw. They withdraw the forces. So it's kind of another one of those Pyrrhic victories. When they look at the actual deaths and missing, wounded and missing, the numbers come out about even between what the Americans lost versus what the British lost. So from that standpoint, you can call it a stalemate, right? But the reality is that the field was left to the British, right? And Newport was left under British control. They didn't control the rest of Rhode Island, but they didn't control the rest of it, right? So John Hancock, and he participated in this, right? I mean, did he charge any breastworks? Was he with the First Rhode Island Regiment? No, he was part of the Massachusetts Regiment that had already retreated. So he has there is no martial glory, right, that comes with John Hancock's name attached to it. But he remained extraordinarily popular, and after the war is over, he is elected the governor of Massachusetts, which he serves, all right, from 1880 basically to 1885, where he basically resigns, and he resigns because he's just it's his health. Specifically, he is one of the people that had been suffering from gout, and he'd been suffering from gout for years.
Yeah.
Okay. He did get married in 1776. All right. Him and his wife. He marries Quincy, all right, who is also very wealthy as well, right? So this is very important. As one of the things that he does as the wealthiest, obviously one of not the wealthiest man in America at a time, was it is a lot of the funding for the American colonies, especially near part of the war, come from people like Hancock. And Hancock is not stingy about the money that he spends to give to the colonials to fight for the cause. Yeah. All right. So he does pour a lot of his own personal wealth, right, directly into the revolution. Right. And the result is that the people of Massachusetts love him, and like I said, he becomes the first governor. The other thing is have you ever seen anybody with gout?
I've seen pictures of the injuries. I've never actually seen it in real life.
I knew a guy that had gout once. It's not a disease we in the modern age are very familiar with.
No.
Right. But it seems to have been very prominent, right, amongst wealthier people, right, due to diet more than anything, right?
Yeah.
Now, gout itself, for the people who don't know, is a type of autoimmune disease, and what happens is that you have uric crystals that begin to form in the joints, and the joints swell up, right? And wherever it happens seems to be the recurring point. There are people who have gout on their hands. There are people who have gouts on their knees. There are people that get gout in their feet and in their ankles and so forth, right? And it swells, and when it swells massively, right? Yeah, your foot it looks like it has an alien egg in it. I mean, the guy that I knew, right? This was when I was in the military, by the way. The guy I knew had got gout, came down with gout, and he we would talk about it. We would talk about the symptoms and everything else, and what you did for it. And what you had to do is you had to stay away from certain food groups generally. Right? Yeah. Things that had a high, I think it was a high content of lysine. Things that had high lysine contents were things that were forbidden. Right? Mm-hmm. Liver was forbidden. Right? It was one of the things that if you ate certain foods, it could trigger an episode. Right? Yeah. Well, the guy I knew, he was one of the few people who loved liver. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't know why some people love liver. I've tasted liver. Okay, liver's horrifying. Okay. Well, liver is one of the few foods that actually makes me gag. I mean, literally makes me want to throw up. Right? That's what it does to me when I eat it. Right? And my mother had it in her head. All right, that she was, while I was growing up, she was going to make sure that her kids ate liver at least once every other month.
Wow.
Right, now my dad loves liver. None of us, the rest of us, love liver. The rest of us hate it. But my mom had it in her head that it was important to give us liver because it was something healthy about it. Because when animals like lions, all right, attacked like a wildebeest or a zebra and put it down, one of the first things that they ate was the liver. I don't know how she knew that. I don't even know if it's true or not. All right, but that was what she told us. All right, so we were going to, because it was so important, we needed to eat liver. Dark veggies, I think, too. It's very possible, Ms. Burns. It's very possible. But one day, this guy, his name was Dave, by the way. Dave decided to pig out on liver and peas, right? And it triggered an episode of gout in his foot, in his leg, right? Mm-hmm. And he was, it swelled to the point where he couldn't even tolerate like a tissue paper hitting his foot. The nerve endings were that distended, right? Mm-hmm. Well, he was taking a shower, he says, right? And we got this after the fact. When all of a sudden, he said, all of a sudden, it was like ultimate relief because the pain just went away, and it was like, oh, watershed moment. And then he looked down. His skin had literally split apart, and he was bleeding out.
Oh. Ew. Oh. Okay.
So we were wondering what happened to him because he disappeared for a couple weeks, you know. And then we heard he had gone to the hospital, and we were like, "What was wrong with it? You know, what happened?" And he was out. Once we found out that he was in the hospital and everything, and he was only there for a couple of days, and then they released him home. But he was gone for a couple of weeks before he came back, and that's when we got the story of what happened today. Right? I was like, gosh, holy shit! You must really love peas and liver if you're willing to go through that, you know. Yeah. But he did. He suffered gout. He had bad. John Hancock had suffered from gout, right? And so he left. All right. He later on returns. Right. Once again, and he dies at the age of 56. Now, unfortunately for him and his wife, right. They have two children, both of whom die, all right, before he does. Neither one of them reach adulthood, right, unfortunately. And so his line like unfortunately many of the founding fathers, their direct lines just basically end, right? Um, you don't have any of the direct descendants of George Washington. You don't have any direct descendants of John Hancock, and so forth. So, which is good in a certain way because you don't end up with an aristocracy when you don't have direct descendants. You know?
Fair.
And the direct descendants, of course, of Jefferson hate the other direct descendants of Jefferson. So we'll not go any further than that, right? We've already discussed that. Now, people ask, was John Hancock involved in slavery? Right? John Hancock's father, all right, his adopted father, did have 2 manservants. All right, as I said before, they were slaves. They were released per his will. All right, following the stated things from his will. That's the only slaves known that he was involved with. There is no record, all right, of John Hancock ever purchasing slaves or selling slaves. Okay, so the people who are saying that he was a slave trader and that he was involved in the slave trading, that's a bunch of malarkey. There's no evidence of that. That's just people that are jealous for the fact. Now, you can say, and this is very true, John Hancock, he wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but while he was young, he was given a silver spoon. Right? I mean, he did become the adopted son of the wealthiest man in America at the time. All right, and he made the most of it. But to say that he was, a smuggler, right? There's no evidence that he ever smuggled anything. There's literally, and when they talk about the smugglers, the people that were that were known smugglers and so forth, they've gone through the records. There is no real evidence that John Hancock was really involved in smuggling. At the same time, smuggling, like I said, while it may not have been ubiquitous, was hardly unknown. All right, in this time frame. All right, so if you're a merchant and you're buying and selling things, it wouldn't to the idea that he was totally above board and he never shaved corners. I would like to say that you have no evidence of that, which they don't, which is true. I can say that, but at the same time, to believe that is a different story. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's one thing to say, okay, you have no evidence of it, but it's another thing to say, well, he definitely didn't engage in it, because it's very possible that in a small amount of ways, in a small number of ways, that he probably did engage in some kind of smuggling here and there. And smuggling is a bit different than piracy. Okay, piracy, you're out there capturing other ships and stealing. Smuggling is you're just not paying the import taxes. You're not paying the motherland taxes or the taxes for things, right? But I think the real thing that gets people upset about him in America, and while he himself was not reviled at the time, right, and it was given a grand funeral, right, after he dies. In the modern age, people look at John Hancock because he was rich, and they like to try and bring him down. There's guys that call him, America's, greatest smuggler. That the only reason he was involved in any of this stuff was because he was trying to protect his smuggling interests and so forth. You have no evidence of making that claim. The reason you're making that claim is you're jealous of the fact that the guy came into wealth, and he did it. It wasn't through his own personal, he didn't pick himself up by the bootstraps, okay, but by the same token, it's not that he was born to it. It would just so happen that circumstances allowed him to become one of the wealthiest men in America. And people are jealous of that, and that's one of the things about jealousy. Jealousy. Jealous of what was going on with a lot of the stuff. And of course, they try to make a play that they were all involved in the slave trade, and they were doing all this stuff. And John Hancock was a part of that. No, he wasn't. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. Right? The one thing we don't know about John Hancock, because he doesn't really talk about it, is you don't know what his views on slavery really were. Right? Aside from the fact that he was in the will when his father died, his adopted father died. He was given 2 slaves that were freed according to the will. That's all you know about him from a slavery standpoint.
Question for you.
Mhm.
Without going into too much detail, were there any of the founding fathers that you would actually use the term, this guy liked slaves?
This guy liked slaves?
I liked the idea that slavery existed. You don't need to give a name. I'm just curious. Would you say that any of them existed?
The ones of the founding fathers, the that liked slavery, the closest you could come, right, is a gentleman named John Calhoun.
Okay.
Right, and John Calhoun, it depends on who you're talking to. You can say that he was a founding father. He's not a. He's more of known for being South Carolinian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a defender from the South Carolinian standpoint. He is also one of the he was one of the proponents of nullification, right? That you've heard me and Mad Dodge argue about. All right, the rights of nullification,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. So there were people that had no problem, or founding fathers that had no problem with slavery.
Yeah.
Right,
Okay.
and that themselves looked upon slavery as neither good nor bad. It was just the way things were. So that they while they were slaves, while they had slaves, they had no problem having people under them that were slaves. That was definitely true, right? Andrew Jackson had no problem with slavery,
Mm-hmm.
literally. It's not that he, but you got to remember back then, like I said, it was a different time frame, but slavery was ubiquitous. The South Carolinians, all right, many of the South Carolinians were staunch advocates of slavery for whatever reason. I think probably because the plantations in South Carolina were a bit different. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Okay, the plantations in South Carolina relied upon tobacco. They were tobacco plantations generally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And slavery was very tobacco is a very to grow tobacco, to export it and import it from a tobacco business is a very labor intensive service, right? So free labor, which is what slavery is, right, is important, right? For the foundations of tobacco farming and so forth. So it's just so the South Carolinians have always had a positive view of slavery, right? For lack of a better term, they always justified in their writings as Christians that slavery was justified. Christ never railed against slavery, etc. Right? So slavery at during the Revolutionary time was still ubiquitous. Okay, you got to remember, the British, you guys didn't free slaves until the 1830.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
no.
that's. Go ahead.
I know we're not. I know people have got this strange idea about the British, but yes, we did, but it did take a while. I've got no problem admitting that.
Oh, right, and then I think that's pretty much everywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact is where was slavery profitable? It's going to be where slavery was going to be utilized the most. And there were people when you talk about founding fathers, right? There were people that enjoyed plantations and a plantation lifestyle, and the life that they lived afforded them by slaves, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Jefferson initially had any qualms about slavery. Right. I think that's something that bothered him over time. Okay. But unfortunately, the way that a lot of these people viewed at the time, viewed slavery at the time, they viewed it from a paternalistic standpoint, or a maternalistic standpoint if you're a woman, that these are okay, if they're humans, they're like childlike humans that need to be protected and need to be sheltered and led. Right? They can't be allowed out on their own devices because they'll hurt themselves. Right? There was that mentality, right, behind slavery at the time, which was absolutely wrong. Glad Sherardi isn't president. Some of my errors.
Now she's not president because she would have commented. There is no two in this. She would have said something.
Yeah. John Calhoun was a very fiery individual. Let's put it that way. But he was another one of the guys that honestly believed himself as being a superior life form to the plebes that were around him. Right. Technically, especially from a legal standpoint, and this is one of the reasons why you can kind of say he's a founding father. A lot of America's judicial processes during that time frame, all right, and how they were looked upon, were brought about by John Calhoun. Right, he was a great lawyer. He really was.
Okay.
Right. As far as a personal man, he was not the best liked, and he was not the nicest guy. Let's put it that way. He was a lawyer.
That was such a polite way of putting that, I have to say.
Okay, but like I said, a lot of the people at the time believed that there was a paternalistic nature to things, and that you had a responsibility as to prevent these people, right, who were obviously not as intelligent, obviously not as smart as you were, obviously not as civilized as you were, that you had a responsibility to take care of them, to bring them and show them enlightenment, right? Mm-hmm. But they could never achieve enlightenment by themselves. They weren't ready for enlightenment themselves, right? They just had to be, taken care of.
Well, as Miss Merge put it, I would also argue that slavery was never a race thing; it was a class thing. What do you say?
It was it to an extent. All right, to an extent, that's very true. Especially early in the early colonial period, that's very true. Mm-hmm. Right, and like I was saying about the Bacon Rebellion, the Bacon Rebellion. What happens as a result of the Bacon Rebellion, right, in Virginia, is the upper aristocracy, all right, limiting slavery to blacks strictly for the purpose of creating a class division within the lower orders, all right, so that they have less chance of getting together, all right, to overthrow their betters, meaning themselves. Okay. Is divide and conquer.
Yeah.
That's what the purpose of it was. I mean, you can go through all these highfalutin ideas if you want about this stuff, but the reality is that it was a power situation that they looked upon. Here's a way of dividing the lower orders so that even though the whites are poor, right? You got white poor. They look at the blacks as, well, I might be poor, but you're black. Okay, so it became a race thing as a result of that expansion.
Yeah.
Okay, and it stems from the Commonwealth of Virginia, the great Commonwealth and great state of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about Virginia at the time frame, this is something else that people don't understand. Virginia. In the later colonial period, and then obviously in the early part of the American period, Virginia is the second most important state in the Union. Okay.
Why?
And the reason for it is because it was of its location, the fact that it was large. It was a large state. Okay, landmass wise, it was one of the largest states landmass wise, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the most populous states, okay, as well. And of course, it had ports. Whereas New York becomes the mercantile center, okay, the primary mercantile center. Richmond and the other port cities like Newport, not Newport, Norfolk, right,
Yeah.
are huge areas of commerce and of shipbuilding, etc. Okay, so for the South to actually pick Virginia, right, as their capital, to pitch Richmond as their capital, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just done because of Robert E. Lee. It was done because you had the second most powerful state in the Union, all right, joining the South now. Now you had a counterbalance for the power, all right, of New York in the you got to remember at the time. People are looking at this at the time frame. The powerhouses of Illinois and Ohio are just starting to make their weight known, right?
Mm-hmm.
But they're not. But they don't have the gravitas, for lack of a better term, of like a New York, right? At to this point, okay, you just don't. Chicago is not the Chicago of that day. It's not the Chicago of today. Okay. So, but in Virginia, right, it is also one of the founding colonies. The first colony, all right, was Jamestown, right, which was in Virginia.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why it's that's why it was so much more powerful than it is today, than it is seen as today. Right. But you also got to remember that all of West Virginia, right, was part of Virginia at that time. West Virginia doesn't come into existence until during 1863, which is in the middle of the Civil War.
Okay.
There's 13 colonies in Virginia that basically rebel against the Virginia, the state of Virginia. It creates the state of West Virginia.
Mm. Fair. Well, do you have a preference of who we talk about next week? I believe it would be classed as your turn.
A preference for who to talk about next week? Let's. Do you want to talk about a British general?
Sure. I have no idea who that is. I mean,
Okay.
I
Or
know
do you
more
want to
about
continue with
this
the
guy.
founding fathers?
Okay.
If you want to continue with the founding fathers, we'll talk about John Adams if you want.
I honestly, it's who you want to talk about because I've picked a few, and I think it's right that it's your turn.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about John Adams then.
Okay. In that case, next week, ladies and gentlemen, John Adams. I'm probably going to find something stupid to say because it's kind of what I do. So, hopefully, you'll be able to join us while we all sit down, be quiet, and learn. We are not doing the beer guy. Be quiet. Sorry, that was Miss Murder.
Do the beer. I think we already talked about Sam Adams, didn't we? Already do
No,
the beer?
not yet. Not yet. We've not done any of the Adamses.
Oh, okay.
In all fairness, if we're going to do that, you know full well I'm going to do Adams family jokes. You know this is happening. Okay. All right then. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out. It's very nice of you. Anything else you want to say, MC?
Good night, everybody.
In that case, goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for coming out, folks.